one of the things, because we often do our job very well and nobody knows what we do, people think our job is simpler than it is, and it is incredibly complex. It's sort of, I often say that we're sort of a bit like ninja Cinderellas, we just sort of come in and fix everything invisibly and do all the work and then dive out again. And I would love to say that we can train everyone who's coming through and give them that knowledge so that they don't jump up too early, but we've been so busy over here that people are stepping up before, and they're learning on the job, which was how I learnt, and there was no formal training.
Sure.
But I know that my location babies, as they are known, they do stay ALMing for longer than I think people who haven't necessarily been through the course, probably because they realise how complex it is.
Locations, go to 2.
Harriet, go ahead.
I'm Harriet Lawrence. I'm a supervising location manager based in London and shooting throughout the UK. This is Locations on 2.
This is Dodd Vickers, your host for Locations on 2, the podcast that takes you around the world and behind the scenes of productions working in all aspects of the entertainment industry. You can find me online at doddvickers.com. Locations on 2 is brought to you by the Location Managers Guild International. The LMGI is a global organization of location professionals working in film, television, and the commercial industry. Find out more by visiting them online at locationmanagers.org. On this episode of the podcast, I'm joined by UK-based location manager Harriet Lawrence. Originally trained as a fine art photographer, Harriet stumbled into the location industry and has gone on to establish a training program for up-and-coming location professionals in the UK. With more than 25 years in the industry, Harriet has been asked to collaborate on such projects as Overlord, The Death of Stalin, Suffragette, 7 Days in Entebbe, and The Personal History of David Copperfield. Let's jump on over to the back channel where the real work gets done on set. Locations on 2. So as I understand it, you started studying photography with an interest in being a photographer, but kind of fell into location management. Is that right? You were interested in being a photographer?
Yeah, I studied photography as my degree, but I think it became fairly evident fairly quickly that making money as an art photographer is rare. It's a wonderful idea to take beautiful pictures and put them on the wall of a gallery, but
right.
The reality is not quite like that. And I sort of fell into location scouting. I just met someone. I had a part-time job in retail, actually, and I met someone who was shooting on the street outside the particular shop we were at. And I got chatting and found, really by accident, a career that I love. My sister's always said that I'm nosy and bossy. I like to call it curious, and bossy. I think I don't even know if I'm organised, but fairly direct. And both sides of the coin just really clicked, and I love both bits. I mean, the scouting obviously is wonderful, and we all love that when you're bringing something creative to the party, and you can actually really, help that creative input and bring some knowledge. And I love talking about architecture. I love talking about mud, in this particular case where I am at the moment. And I love talking about brickwork and knowing the sort of different types of brickwork or different types of geography or architecture that are sort of in different parts of the country. So that really, really resonated with me. But I actually do love the problem solving and the complexity of sort of putting it together and enabling all the other departments to do their jobs, because actually, as you know, the better we do that, the less anyone actually knows what we've done.
Sure. What part of the country did you grow up in? Were you a city girl or a country girl, or where did you grow up?
I was in Scotland until I was 18. Just between Edinburgh and Glasgow, and then moved down to London to go to Chelsea School of Art before realising that I couldn't actually draw. So my degree was then in photography, and then I messed around for a few years trying to work out what I really wanted to do. I did a bit of picture editing. Just as the internet was starting back in the early 90s, I was editing a website on astronomy. And I'm one of the most inept computer technical people.
Oh, really?
My partner is sitting at the end of the sofa nodding furiously. And of course, the internet didn't really exist to most people. And I found I was having conversations with NASA's picture library. And I knew nothing about astronomy either, but it's one of those sort of little things that you fall into. And it enabled me to start working in the film industry because that was freelance and they just wanted a certain number of days a month. And so it did give me some money coming in, which, of course, when you're starting in the industry, especially, over 25 years ago, it was quite hit and miss whether you'd get any work. I don't know what it's like in the States now, but certainly over here in the UK, certainly pre-COVID, and it does seem to be now, there is so much work around. So those sort of junior members of the department who are starting out really don't have that sort of fear that, you might only work 2 days a month when you first start. They seem to have lots and lots of opportunities. So the picture editing helped me have an income, which meant I could pick up work on set and really discovered that it's something I loved. Yeah.
So you were working retail management, and they were filming outside of your shop you were working in?
What it was, but it was a commercial.
What production was it? Do you remember?
Location manager comes in and says,
"Oh, okay,
we're closing the road next week. Do you have any deliveries or trucks?" And I was like, "Oh, that sounds interesting. What do you do? What did you say you do?" And we got chatting and we stayed in touch, and that was really how I fell into it by accident. Yes, yeah.
And you also started in commercials. So you were doing commercials before you made the jump to film and a more grander types of productions, I guess you would say, although commercials have their own complexity to them,
I have to say, sort of towards the end of the 90s, I was getting rather tired of kitchens, suburban kitchens, a lot of commercials. If you think about all the cleaning products and the cereal and the foods, there's lots and lots of kitchens. I think if you do the great adverts, big car adverts or, some sort of epic ones where you're traveling all over the country, finding wonderful locations, then, those are exciting and still challenging. But an awful lot of commercials are, suburban houses. So, and once I moved into drama and independent films, then you sort of stay wherever your niche is.
So you started in commercials in the early 90s, and then was that through the person that you met that came into the store? Did they help you get in, or did you explore it and manage to get in on your own? I did
later, but he did introduce me to someone that I then went and assisted. And, back in those days, it was literally a department of two. So he gave me a few contacts, and I made the most of those. And someone very kindly took me out onto set. And I literally had no idea what a film set looked like. Runner came up to me and said, "Do you want a call sheet?" And I sort of looked slightly blank and went, "I don't know. Do I? It's a call sheet." I mean, literally, you are thrown in. Back in those days, you were thrown in the deep end, and you sank or swim. Really. Actually, I was thinking about it recently because one of the first commercials that I location managed was again through this contact. So quite often, back then, you would assist someone a little bit and they would be quite often juggling several commercials, and you would then just be left to look after the shoot on the day, knowing nothing. And the first shoot that happened to me on was a girl that was tied to a railway line with a steam train coming towards her, all shot with a hand crank Mitchell camera. And there was a level crossing, and there was a van that rushed up to try and help the girl in the nick of time. And strangely, I haven't filmed at that. It was a preserved railway, obviously, rather than the main British Rail network rail line. And I haven't filmed there for 25 years, but actually, I'm in contact with them and hopefully going to film with them next year. So I was thinking about that first commercial. It was for Ford vans. shot in black and white with that hand crank style.
I was going to say it sounds like the perfect metaphor for you being left alone on your first set is you being tied, somebody being tied to the railway. And one of the things,
I don't know if you know the Wallace and Gromit set of films. I think it's The Wrong Trousers, and there's a sort of crazy penguin that goes off on a train, and Gromit is hastily laying down the track just in front of the train. So he's in a carriage just in front of the train, laying down track as it goes. And I always think, sort of like penguin who's got a gun and he's sort of like on a runaway train. It's a bit like the director, just sort of blindly going on. And Wallace is dancing around going, "It will be fine, it will be fine." So he's the producer. And then Gromit, is the grafter. And he's the one that's actually laying the track in front of it, keeping it all on track. And no one probably notices it. But I think that's quite a good sort of little film that is how we feel sometimes in the location department.
That's a great illustration I haven't heard before, because that is exactly what we're doing most of the time. It's, putting it all together to keep the camera moving, and it starts long before the camera ever shows up. How long have you been on this? In the first week of the shoot, and you sort of say, well, since March or something. They have no comprehension that the location manager has been, and the location department have been setting this up for a very long time. What did, when you obviously had a limited exposure to film before you got into it by accident, you met this location manager and then you get into the business, how different was your perception of what the job was from what you were doing when you first got in?
It was one of those moments where, I met someone, seemed like a good idea. And actually, once I got into it, I loved all that curiosity, that detective work that you go finding locations. I don't think I'd actually given filming and film crews much thought at all. I mean, it certainly wasn't an option when you were at school of sort of, there are people behind the camera. That's never really explained to you, or certainly wasn't back then. So I loved it. I loved people, which of course, everyone who does our job loves.
Sure.
Loves meeting strange and interesting and wonderful people along the way, and that sort of that way that you connect very quickly with crews, and you have to sort of make things happen. It's quite transient, but I enjoy it.
When you first started, were you doing more of the logistics, or were you involved in the creative side of things? Because I know that, we've talked about it so many times with others. It does seem that, and you hinted at it, most people think it's the logistics is our job, but there's so much more to it than that. Were you dealing primarily with the logistics, or were you being brought into the creative role from the very beginning?
And covering the shoot, but it was very much about scouting, which I think is probably more so because I started in commercials. So now, I think if you start in TV and drama and film, you will do a long time probably on the floor as a junior member of the department before you move up. And it's quite a long time before you probably end up scouting. Whereas, in 1993, 94, it was literally go and find 10 swimming pools that I can film in. A location manager who'd already been doing it for 15, 20 years at that point was like, right, okay, how do I do that? And in those days, you would drive around with yellow pages. I don't know what the equivalent of a phone directory is in the States, but, it's sort of like a doorstep of a book that's 10 inches thick, and you'd go driving off with 2 or 3 of those in the boot of your car and rolls of film, and come back several days later and have to get it all developed and stuck on bits of black card and then shown to the client. But it was just sort of ingenuity and detective work, because no one really told you how you go about finding something. It's just go and do it and come back with something. So,
what was did you have any interesting experiences those first days of scouting and trying to figure out how to pull this off? Did you
old-fashioned mansion block of flats with a staircase where we could get a goat to run down? I cannot tell you what that commercial was for, but I do remember thinking at the end of it, don't work with goats again. And funnily enough, there are goats in the script that I'm working on at the moment. And we need to get them to an island that's tidal. And I'm just thinking, yeah, I can just see how this is going to go. If we have to get them on a sort of boat, take them out to an island, this is not going to go to plan. Goats do not do what you want them to do. And the goats, I remember, would not run down this staircase at all. So it was probably in the days before you had humane animal handlers. So I'm sure there was someone just shoving the goat from behind in the hope it would run down the stairs. But yeah, that was quite interesting, because most rather lovely, beautiful mansion blocks of flats were not particularly welcoming to having a stinking goat running down their stairs. So I actually had to find, that was thinking outside a box of sort of finding an empty building that was going to be developed and that had a beautiful staircase. I can't remember exactly where and actually I can remember it was somewhere, it was an old college near Notting Hill, and it had a very beautiful staircase. But every job's different, as you know. I mean, we learn something new on every job, don't we? And that's part of the fun, isn't it?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. And shifting gears, going from maybe a period piece to a contemporary piece, and, trying to look at things slightly differently and set aside the things you were trying to avoid that you now can embrace.
A lot of
certainly
the stuff
impact,
that I've done in recent years has been period. But then last year I spent a very different year working again with Armando Iannucci on his latest project, Avenue 5, which is an HBO drama set in space in sort of 40 years in the future. And there were lots of big sets in Leavesden, Warner Brothers Leavesden Studios. And any of the story that took place back on Earth was sort of my domain, out on location. But of course, so we were trying to find things that looked like America in 40 years' time. There weren't many locations, but it was great fun. And we ended up actually filming at McLaren headquarters, who have a wonderful architectural building. It's just stunning. It may be it's about 15 or 18 years old now, but it still looks incredibly modern. And that was a real pleasure to go and do that, which was so different to a lot of the period stuff that I've been doing. Well, yes.
Well, that is period in a way, though. You think about it, and it's a future period that you're imagining. So you're. But I even here we've done, I've worked on shows set in the 80s, and that is very much a period of its own. It doesn't have to be, Victorian or Edwardian era to be period. You've got certain considerations that people don't think about. Here we've got the Americans with Disabilities Act and all these implementations of ramps and things that would not have existed at that time. And suddenly you move into a building that works perfectly, but then you've got handicap ramps and accommodations that would not have been there, that you've got to figure out how to hide or work around to pull off the shot. So there's similar considerations you have in a older period film, but you get a contemporary period. You've got things that you've got to
when I'm teaching,
consider that maybe you're not thinking of when you first get into the project.
Anything before about 2000 is period. Now, people were smoking inside restaurants. Go back years ago, people were smoking in aeroplanes and trains, which, the younger generation just look at me as if I'm completely nuts. It's like, no, people just smoked everywhere. And little things like that. I mean, I don't know whether you've had all your parking meters removed, but pretty much anywhere in London now, your parking is done on a text app. So there are no parking meters, or, just small stuff, isn't it? And telephone boxes and electric car chargers.
Telephone boxes,
So, I've not actually had to try and have them removed yet. But I'm sure the time will come when someone says, can we just lose that? Because they're now, everywhere, aren't they? Electric chargers, they're popping up everywhere. So that, the challenges change, don't they?
Yeah. Yes, I'm here. For example, we've got bike lanes going in all over Atlanta, and then you add to that a new trolley system we didn't have that they've added, and you add all these levels of complexity that you didn't have to think about. So the next time you go downtown in Atlanta, you've suddenly got something totally new that you've never had to deal with. What we can do
now are brilliant. And I did an interview a couple of years ago, and someone was asking if, the ease and the quality of visual effects would make our job slightly more redundant. But actually, I think it offers so many more opportunities, because often we find the perfect house, but, let's say it needs to be by the sea. There was a film I did a few years ago, My Cousin Rachel, and the house is scripted as being near the sea. But of course, we didn't find the perfect house by the perfect bit of coast. But because of the magic of CGI, we could find the perfect house and we could find the perfect bit of coast and put them together. And, 5 years ago, even, all the television aerials we'd have to actually have removed. Whereas now, fortunately, that falls into the world of visual effects rather than actually having to have all those things taken down and put back up.
Yeah, we're dealing with the same thing with even crowds shooting in the current environment. We were filming a movie and you had crowd scenes, and suddenly you can't have all those people on set anymore. We've got to figure out a way to add the people, which we would have just hired, hundreds of background in the old days. And now we've even incorporated that into the new filming. You can do in reverse, adding in people as opposed to just adding in antennas or whatever. How do you think your photography interest, as an art photographer, do you feel like that helped you with presenting locations, or do you feel like you had to think differently about how you photograph things when you're going out scouting for a location? Do you think that was a little bit of a help to you?
Means that whoever has asked you to go scouting is pleased with the results, that you capture it. Even the simplest things of getting your verticals vertical and your horizontals horizontal, framing it, all of those sort of simple things. If you're out scouting and you can produce good, well-exposed photos, then you're going to be asked back. It is different. Certainly when you're going out scouting, you're not going to take a beautiful close-up detail of a drain or a small flower or whatever else you might, find curious. But those sort of things I can still photograph and put on my Instagram or whatever and still enjoy that aspect of it. But the art photography side of it isn't so relevant, but the being able to take a decent photo is.
Have you found, I know that I was talking to Mike Fantasia and he mentioned, and I talked about shooting windows, like stained glass windows in a place. There was no stained glass windows in the script, but the windows in this one building we were in were so beautiful that I just couldn't resist taking some photographs of them, and I left them in, and they ended up adding a scene or kind of a establishing where they incorporated some shots of the windows because they did like them as well. Mike talked about shooting a doorknob in a location, and that sold the location to somebody. Have you had an instance where you took that artsy photo and left it in, and it helped sell a location?
There are occasions where you do try really hard to make it look beautiful, or you do include other things. There's of course other occasions where a location has been scouted and photographed and the director's just glossed over it, and you go yourself to photograph it on a different day and different light, and the director never knows that they've seen it twice and chooses it. So how you photograph it is definitely important.
You touched on a little bit, and one of the things I wanted to make sure we covered in our conversation was the training program that you do, which I think is really great because, we do have, I don't know what it's like there, but for a long time, we did not have enough people trained in the job. And so you were kind of on the job training people and bringing in people that may not have been quite ready to do the job and trying to get them up to speed. And they, we've got some people that came out on the other side, kind of trial by fire, that are very good. But then you feel like maybe somebody else that didn't come through the other side and walked away could have been very good if they'd been given a little more training and you had a little more time to invest in it. Talk a little bit about the training programs that you've worked on with film. Is it Film Focus, I believe?
It started not long actually after I had my son, and I carried on working in the film industry pretty much up until I had him, and was shooting again not many months after he was born. But I didn't want to work full time, obviously, at that time. And Film London were developing a location manager's training course, and I came in to advise on the content. which was great. It got you really thinking about all aspects of our job. And, the list is pretty endless, as we know, and it changes on every job, and you become experts on different things and you solve other problems. And I really enjoyed that. And then the person that they had running the course wasn't particularly knowledgeable about the actual film industry and filming, and for whatever reason he parted company, and they were halfway through the first year of running it. And so I stepped in, and actually we had a really big review of it after the first year. Now that must be going back to about 2006 or 2007, and we I completely took the curriculum apart and changed the structure of it. And so the content was mostly there, but it was just how it was structured. And we ended up structuring it over 6 months with 1 weekend a month. So it was aimed at people who were already in the location department and had a year or two of experience behind them. And we got working location managers in to teach them different sections. So obviously we broke it down into the different parts of our job of sort of, and even got some actually quite corporate things in. So we have someone who comes in and teaches communication in quite a corporate way, but it works because that's not something we do in our industry. So it makes people stop and think. And then we do script breakdowns and scouting and photography, and we look at budgeting and planning it and the legal aspects and health and safety. We look at electrical parts, we put in drones now, all those aspects that just are part of it, and then managing the shoot and all the logistical paperwork and so on that comes with that. And so that sort of really worked because they could carry on working between each weekend, so they were still earning money rather than trying to do it over a sort of 3-week, slightly more indigestible sort of solid bank of lessons.
Mm-hmm.
And we got I was adamant that it had to be working location managers who were current and relevant and knew what they were doing. And we got some of the top locations. Well, we still get the top location managers in the UK involved, and each of the students was given, again, a working location manager as a mentor. So they had a lot of input that, but we don't run the course every year. I don't have the capacity to run it every year because I tend to go off and work, and it's quite a lot of planning and time to keep it running. But we've run it probably 6 times now, and we have sort of 18 to 20 students each year. But we have the same problem that you have, Dodd, that there are not enough trained people coming through. And I'm passionate about not throwing people in and expecting them to sink or swim. I think that's very bad for their mental health. I think it's bad for our craft because I think they make mistakes and because they don't have the knowledge and the skills. And I think one of the things, because we often do our job very well and nobody knows what we do, people think our job is simpler than it is, and it is incredibly complex. It's sort of, I often say that we're sort of a bit like ninja Cinderellas, we just sort of come in and fix everything invisibly and do all the work and then dive out again. And I would love to say that we can train everyone who's coming through and give them that knowledge so that they don't jump up too early. But we've been so busy over here that people are stepping up before, and they're learning on the job, which, was how I learnt. And, there was no formal training,
Sure.
But I know that my location babies, as they are known, they do stay ALMing for longer than I think people who haven't necessarily been through the course, probably because they realise how complex it is. So they tend not to step up too quickly. They spend a long time, sort of 4 or 5 years at the ALM stage, consolidating their knowledge. What was great this year, this year has been incredibly challenging for everyone, but what's really good, we managed to keep the course sort of running in a different way throughout lockdown. So over the 3 or 4 months of lockdown, we had 11s every Tuesday on Zoom, and brought in a whole wealth of experts, other location managers to talk about their experiences. So we brought a lawyer in to talk about contracts. We brought a company in to talk about greening the industry. We talked about sort of specific shooting on the move and traffic control and things like that. So they had actually this long period of meeting a whole variety of people that we probably wouldn't normally have time to cover in the course. And then towards the end of the course, we give them a bit of a more meaty assignment to do. And we give them a little fictitious script, which has every sort of possible thing that you could probably not want in the same script. So, one of the scripts has runaway horses, it has lightning, it has rain, it has someone falling down the stairs and going on fire, it has guns, it has piles of food and flickering candles and huge crowd scenes and all of those sort of things. And another of the scripts has, aliens and futuristic police on bikes and drones and a slightly sort of broken, dysfunctional society. So we cram these all into a sort of 2-page script and then set them off to find a location and literally think of every aspect, budget it, do the plans, do the movement orders, do the health and safety risk assessments, cost up everything they would need to make that script work. And that's quite involved, and they need to set aside quite a lot of time. And then again, myself and another location manager work through that to sort of hopefully they have it all covered and we have taught them properly.
Yeah, I had an experience where I inherited a show. Another location manager left, and I was brought in to take over and start talking. I don't know, I make this assumption sometimes and find out not everybody is structured the same way, but on a lot of shows we have assistant managers, and then we have a key assistant manager or two, and then a location manager or supervising location manager. And the keys are kind of maybe junior location managers, really. I mean, the assistants it's kind of a weird intermediate step. And I had 2 keys, and I start talking about some of the things we need. It was an episodic, and I'm saying, well, you should probably reach out to such and such department at this government agency. And they're like, okay, how do I do that? And I realized they hadn't even managed at any level. They were PAs that got bumped up by this person. And I was sitting there for a minute just thinking, how nervous can this person be? You were just handed a role you have zero experience working in. You've just been a set PA, and suddenly you're solving the problems that we deal with every day. And I had to take a deep breath, slow down, and help realize, I don't want to replace this person. I see the potential in them, and I want to bring them along. But yet I've got a show to run that is incredibly demanding, because we've got 10 days to find locations, clear locations, scout locations, and go to work. And I just was sitting there like, what can this person be feeling right now, being handed this responsibility without any experience doing it? And hearing about your program is like, gosh, I wish we had something like that they could have gotten involved in on the weekend, so they could have been training up a little bit before they just got dumped into this role. I
think even 2-day courses, and we've run a lot of 2-day courses just to give people a slight overview of what's involved in our department, because I think half of them are quite happy to accept that responsibility that you were talking about, because they're not aware that actually it should be a lot more complicated than it first seems.
Sure.
And 2-day courses really work in giving them a sort of opening their eyes to how complex it is.
Right. Yeah, I just think they had no idea what they were going to be asked to do, and you just tell them, and they're like, well, how did you know that? And I'm like, well, I've been doing this for a minute, it's not. Yeah.
On our longer course, the 6-month one, they benefit so much because, they meet so many experienced location managers as tutors. And then, they all have their own mentor, and they meet other people's mentors. And these are, the top location managers in film and TV in the country. And it's really good for them to gain that experience and hear the stories, the war stories that when it went wrong,
right.
And we've all got those.
What's the worst story you have where something went totally wrong and yet you managed to become the ninja Cinderella that you mentioned earlier and solve that problem?
Do you know what? I think it's a bit like childbirth. I think once you've done it, you sort of forget about it. Otherwise, you'd never do it again. There have been a couple. I mean, they're not total disasters, but I know some stories that have gone very wrong, and you're left there. But there are places where the people that I signed the contract with weren't the right people.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, there was a film we did a few years ago, Overlord, and we were filming in a railway tunnel, and I had assigned it was a disused railway tunnel, so there was no train track in it, and we'd been there for 6 weeks with the art department, construction, prepping it. We had a signed contract from the owners, and the day before the main unit moved in, I had a call on the radio saying there was a man in a high-vis jacket who was measuring up the front of the tunnel for something. And I was like, oh, nobody told me he was coming down. So I went down to meet him and discovered that he was down there at the request of the owners for a once-a-year inspection. And the owners weren't the people that I'd signed the contract with.
Oh, goodness.
So that all got quite legal. And obviously we were dealing with American studio. So they were working at the opposite hours of the 24 hours to us to try and get answers. And that went back and forth for a bit. And we did solve it, but it was one of those, wow, I've been doing this for more than 20 years and I didn't see that coming. And I think the original people that had signed the contract did genuinely believe they owned it, but in fact they only owned the trackway either side of the tunnel, not the actual tunnel. Anyway, that was one of them. A good one was filming in the House of Commons, which we took Suffragette into the House of Commons.
You were the first to film in there, weren't you?
Commercially, yes. I mean, obviously they have televised visits and state openings and things like that. But we were the first commercial film to go in there. And I think there was a bit of serendipity. The right people were in the right place. I mean, it took 6 months of nurturing that relationship, and they could organise state visits from Obama and other heads of state and royalty and so on. But a film crew is all a little bit more feral, isn't it? It's the junior runners are used to just going off and fixing things by themselves, and I think this made Parliament really quite nervous because it is like herding cats, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
And because we're used to solving things there and then and not waiting, we all just get on and do things, and that's not how somewhere like the House of Commons Parliament runs. There are protocols and you have to do things their way. And we did 4 days of rioting suffragettes and horses and all sorts of things, and it was amazing. And I had to pinch myself, and I was walking through sort of dark courtyards in the back of Parliament that most people don't go at the end of a shoot day with the moon over Big Ben, thinking, we pulled that off. We've actually done it. And but they didn't sign the contract till the day before the shoot.
Oh,
so
boy.
That was always. I mean, one of it was they couldn't quite decide who should sign our contract. I mean, we'd spent weeks discussing the contract and changing it and minute changes and things. But I ended up, signing it on the Friday afternoon, the day before we started shooting. It was a little bit close for comfort.
Do you find that the relationship you have to establish with the production designer is critical to your success as a location manager, or is it the producers you feel that you have to keep happier in those early creative stages of a production?
Well, it's both, really, isn't it? Because we've got a responsibility to both, to the creative side and the logistics, which is what I think makes our job really, really interesting, because it's quite an unusual combination skill set, the logistics and the creative. I mean, obviously working with a designer who is collaborative and interested in what we can bring to the table is a much more enjoyable experience. But equally, we do have to have that slight sense of responsibility that we're not presenting the most gorgeous, the most aesthetic, the most beautiful location that is absolutely going to cripple the budget. That would not get us employed again. So having having both those hats on is a challenge. And that's one of the challenges that I love, because, I referred earlier to this tidal island, which has got nothing more than a shack on it. And we want to shoot on it, and we want to take some goats out to it. And my designer, who I've worked with a couple of times before, walked away from one day on a recce there and said, I think this is my favourite location ever. And she's been, in the industry for 25 years as well. And I just thought, wow, she's done a lot of things. I've got to pull this off. If she's saying this to me, then this really, really matters, and I want to pull it off. And, we are still working on the logistics of how we get to the island. And quite frankly, once we're on the island, we're there for the day. And then we have to think about the dull but important things like toilets. We might only go over with a reduced crew, but I start worrying about how we get the goats there, and they've got hooves. And if we've got a rib, are the hooves going to puncture the rubber dinghy, the rib? And just, your mind runs away with sort of all the problems of, what are we going to do about toilets? What are we going to do with these goats? And what if the goats run away and run into the sea? Any number of things could go wrong with this. But, so working with a designer who's collaborative is great, but it's also fantastic when you've got a really collaborative sort of line producer or producer who understands those that sort of clash sometimes of budget versus aesthetic. And if you can have those open conversations, and I really think working across the board together and being very upfront and open makes for a much nicer job. I mean, one of the wonderful things about Copperfield was it really, really felt like we were all in it together, and every HOD was keen to work through the problems themselves. Copperfield was great because the designer really, really was interested in what I brought to the table, and Armando really wanted to move slightly away from visual effects and do a lot of the effects in the camera. So it meant our DP and our designer worked very closely together to work out how to do some of these effects and make it very theatrical, but in camera. So there were a lot of challenges on that. That was another film that was a lot about tides and boats.
That's the.
That is a little bit of a war story. We had a little harbour in David Copperfield that was. It had a sort of fixed lock gate, so the tide never went in and out. It was just locked in, and those gates hadn't been taken out for about 10 years. But we needed to take them out to get the boats in, and we needed to make sure that was at one of the highest tides, which we did. But the gates were taken out and serviced, and they were only brought back a couple of days before we filmed, and they put them in, and they worked beautifully, and the water stayed in the harbour, and that was all very lovely, and we were all quite pleased. But then so that was the test to see if the gates fitted after their refurbishment. And then they took the gates out. Now, this had to be done by crane. The gates had to be pulled out by crane. And so they took them out again so that we could get the boats in at the high tide. And when they put the gates back in for the second time, they started leaking. So if you imagine a dock of water, and it's got these lock gates, there's basically panels that slot in, and it started leaking. And I got a text at midnight, which I should know better than to look at texts at midnight. I got a text.
We all should,
from the expert at the dock saying it's not looking good. It's still leaking. Well, of course, at that point, you're never going to go back to sleep because you don't know what you're going to be walking into the next morning. And so, after a couple of hours of not sleeping, I thought, well, I might as well drive over. And we had to hire one of the biggest pumps possible from the Environment Agency and pump water from one area to another. And I think we only lost a few inches of water over the shooting day. But that was interesting. And it was one of those things that, of course, nobody, the designer, the producers, didn't really know what was going on in the background. And we didn't really want them to share the stress, but
it's hard not to bring them in sometimes because you just want to pass some of that stress off. But yeah, it's important not to at times as well.
Yeah, it's deciding when to share it, isn't it?
Yeah.
The tricky balance.
Do you have a specific collaboration with a designer? Like, have you worked with some of these people multiple times, and there's one you really get excited to get that call from, or have most of them been one-offs? Because we talk about this being like a war at times, where you go off to war with a group and you finish it, and you have you look back on it really fondly, and you kind of miss those people after you're done, even though you didn't at the time.
It's like banging your head against a brick wall, isn't it? When it stops, it's wonderful. Yeah, no, several of the designers I've worked with multiple times, and those are the ones that are rewarding. And there's a TV director that I worked with for several years, and that was very creative for me, because he would bring me on to do some very early scouting long before we were in production, and I would do 3 or 4 weeks. And talking about you were saying about the stained glass window, and I would find stuff that would work their way into the script, and that was, I worked 6 or 7 times with this director over 10 years, and that was very collaborative. But yes, I love working with designers that enjoy the process, the detective bit that we do.
Yeah, it's fun when they, I was doing something and I took a black and white shot once of something for myself, really, and I accidentally left it in the files that I uploaded. But it turned.
Was that an accidentally on purpose?
No, it was actually totally accidental. but it really, I thought of it later, and the director actually came to me later and said, "Do more of that," because that helped me get a better feel for a lighting aspect of that window, or where it was positioned, because the contrast was such, it was different than the color photograph, and it made me think of a shot differently that I went on to talk to the cinematographer about. And it's really nice when something that you've done, even if it is accidental, can have that creative impact where you really feel like you were collaborating more than just following through on a task of going and finding a location.
Yeah, I mean, you probably see from my resume that most of what I do is independent films or drama, and I find that it's more creative and that I can have more input, and that the director I'm working with at the moment, we will share not just photos, but I share interesting articles that I find from the historical aspect, and something fell into my inbox the other day, or my news feed, about old songs that the barge people who used to sail these beautiful old sailing barges, they used to sing. And it was, it was nothing to do with locations really, but I'm enjoying that relationship, and that Bio, our director, is just so interested in every aspect of it. And also, we can meet really interesting people. Now, that person itself might not be helping me with the location in the end, but they might have some really interesting knowledge. Mm-hmm. And again, on the show that I'm doing at the moment, the director and designer are so interested in all those tiny historical details that being able to put interesting people in touch with them, so that helps to add to their creative vision and research, then if I can help make those connections, then I'm definitely adding something quite important to it.
Absolutely.
And this is the sort of thing I love, messing around with boats and horses and trains, and learning all these things about what life was like 130 years ago on the edge of the world, and in that sort of barge community. I mean, sometimes it's something quite unexpected that you think is going to be easy, and then is quite hard to find. And sort of bizarrely, on a couple of films, it's been a church, and you'd think Britain is absolutely stuffed full of churches. We're particularly looking for an isolated pre-Victorian one, and we're up to nearly 100 churches that we've scouted. And you'll find one that has the most amazing interior, but actually you can't get a good shot of the exterior because there are lots of trees surrounding it, or a really beautiful one, or it's too far away. I mean, always the sort of distance that you can travel from base is a challenge. And, if only we could take that out of the equation, we could put together an even more stunning film. That's part of what we do, isn't it? To try and find those perfect locations within whatever our travel distance is from base.
It is, yeah. And when you get a script, what gets you fired up? When you read a script, is there something you'll hit a moment in the script and you'll go, okay, I really am excited about this project, that you feel particularly passionate about it? I've got projects that come to me periodically and you end up doing it and you look back on it and it was really more about, okay, I did my job because I was hired to do my job, but it wasn't something that I felt particularly rewarded by. And I did a good job for them, but it wasn't as exciting as something else I really could, sink my teeth into and get excited about. Is there a type of script or something in a script you see that you go, this is something I can really have some fun with?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are some scripts which are much more appealing. I mean, there's certainly a couple that I've read in the last couple of years that I know I could do, and I could do probably perfectly well, but they're just not necessarily me right now. And certainly the one that I'm doing at the moment has everything that makes me excited, and actually took me to an area of England that I didn't know particularly well. And know incredibly well now. I was scouting it before lockdown. Unfortunately, there are a lot of big cinematic exteriors. So, just as lockdown lifted, I could go back out and scout it. And I didn't have to do a huge amount of door knocking at that stage. So that it was those sort of wide open landscapes that were so good. And that sort of thing I love, absolutely love, because, each frame that I can go and photograph and scout is like, a beautiful photo, and bringing that back and introducing the director and designer to somewhere new and exciting is also really satisfying.
What do you think when you're teaching your class? Is there a specific skill set that you feel is critical to being really good as a location manager or locations person that is hard to teach? That people just have to kind of already have in their quiver when they come to the table to do this job? Or do you feel like most of the skills can be taught?
A lot of them can be taught. I think there is a certain intuition. There's something that we call nous. I've no idea if it translates, if nous is something that exists in the American vocabulary, but it's that sort of intuition, it's common sense, it's my partner's very helpfully looking it up. I think it's NWSE. But it's just according to Google, it's common sense, practical intelligence. It also says it's a philosophy of the mind or the intellect. It is the bit that you can't teach. It is that instinct. I think also having hunger and curiosity beyond just ticking a box is essential to be a good location manager or a good scout, and that can't necessarily be taught. So there is an element that the best assistants that go on to be the best location managers have, that is part of their DNA, I think. You can teach the legal stuff. You can teach photography. You might not be able to teach someone to be the best photographer, but you can certainly teach them to take better photos. You can teach them, you can give them a list of all the things that you need to think about before you start shooting. But I think the ones that elevate above that are the ones that have an artistic curiosity, an interest in every aspect of what you're researching and photographing and scouting, and then, obviously the logistics of putting it together.
This has been Locations on 2, the podcast taking you around the world and behind the scenes with location managers working in all aspects of the entertainment industry. Locations on 2 is brought to you by the Location Managers Guild International. Visit them online at locationmanagers.org. For more episodes of Locations on 2, you can visit us online at locationson2.com or look anywhere you get your other favorite podcasts. This is Dodd Vickers, your host for Locations on 2, and I can be found at doddvickers.com. Until next time, I'm switching back to Channel 1.